Now, I'd studied some about these differences in the Gospels and the harmonization attempts, but I hadn't really looked at them. And then as I went more and more into my doctoral research, I was reading through the burial and resurrection narratives in the Gospels in Greek 35 times. And as I was doing this, all of a sudden more different of these differences in the Gospels started to stand out to me. And I started to realize there are some things that just don't harmonize as well when you subject them to harmonization efforts. So here I want to present to you 3 essential issues for understanding differences in the Gospels. Number 1, the first thing we want to do is look at it and determine whether we are looking at a contradiction or a difference. Now let me explain. Back in 1912, when the Titanic sank, there were conflicting eyewitness testimonies. Some of the witnesses said that the Titanic broke in half and then sank. Others said, she went down in one piece. Now, how do you get that wrong? I mean, here you are in the middle of the Atlantic Ocean. It's the most terrifying night of your life. You're out there in this lifeboat, and there's only one thing really that you can see in front of you, and it's this big thing. It's about 800 and some feet long. It's all lit up, and people are screaming coming from, you hear screams coming from it. How do you get it messed up that it breaks in two and then sinks? Or, it went down in one piece? Well, I don't know. But both of their testimonies are contradictory. There is no way of harmonizing them. It either broke in half and sank, or it didn't. These are contradiction. That's a contradiction. A difference, on the other hand, let's say I go home. Now, I'll be going home Tuesday, returning to Atlanta area where I live. And let's say I come in at night to the front door, and my wife says, "Mike, got great news for you." And what happened was about an hour ago, the doorbell rang, and I came down to the front door, and there's this guy standing there with this big check for $15 million. And he says, "You've just won Publishers Clearinghouse." Boy, that'd be good news. And so then, that's fantastic. Well, half an hour later, I hear my wife talking to her mom, and she says, "You won't believe what just happened. The doorbell rang, I came downstairs, and there's 2 guys at the front door, and one's got this check for $15 million, and this other guy's videotaping and says, 'You've just won Publishers Clearinghouse, congratulations.'" Now she gets off the phone, and I say, "You just contradicted yourself." "Well, what do you mean?" "Well, you said there was just one guy at the door, and he's the guy talking." "Well, I didn't say there was just one. I just mentioned that guy because I wanted to tell you quickly and summarize it up. I didn't want to go into all the details. And I just told you about this one guy, and I had him talking, but it was actually the guy videotaping, and there were 2 of them, and the guy videotaping is the one that said that to me." It's not a contradiction, it's a difference for the context. Let me show you a couple examples of these in the Gospels. How many women went to the tomb? This is something that Erhnman and many other skeptics will bring up. How many went to the tomb? The Synoptic Gospels, Matthew, Mark, and Luke, say that there were multiple women, whereas you come to the Gospel of John, it says Mary got up early in the morning while it was still dark and went to the tomb and found it empty. So which one is it? Were there multiple women, or were there just one? Well, what's really interesting here is when you read John chapter 20, verses 1 and 2. It says, early in the morning while it was still dark, after the Sabbath, Mary got up, went to the tomb, and found it empty. And so she came back, verse 2, she ran back to and said to Peter and the beloved disciple, "They have taken the Lord, and we don't know where they've laid him." We? Who's we? Well, maybe that's Peter and the beloved disciple, and Mary, maybe maybe, or maybe she's speaking for others. Are there any other examples of this? Well, I'm glad you asked, because in fact there is. When you go to Luke chapter 24, it's really interesting. Who ran to the tomb after the women reported it? Well, according to John, it says that Peter and the beloved disciple got up when Mary said this, and they ran to the tomb, and they found it just like Mary said, and then they both went home. But when you read the story in Luke, when the women came back and said they've taken the Lord, the tomb's, or no, they don't say that the tomb is empty. We saw some angels. And it says Peter got up and ran to the tomb and found it just like the women had said, and then he went home. Well, wait a minute, that just said just Peter. No, it didn't say just Peter. It just mentions Peter. What's really interesting is 12 verses later what Luke reports. In that case, now it's the Emmaus disciples. They're walking along the road. Jesus joins them, and it says their eyes were kept from recognizing him. So the more I read this text, the more I just start to laugh because Jesus is playing with these guys. It says that their eyes were kept from recognizing. He pulls up, and they're talking. He says, what are you guys talking about? Why such the long faces? Are you the only guy in Jerusalem that doesn't know what's happened? And Jesus says, what? Wouldn't that have been fun? No, tell me, what? What happened? So they get talking about this, and they say, yeah, we thought Jesus was the Messiah, but they just killed him on Friday. But the women went to the tomb this morning, and they saw angels, and he said he's been raised from the dead. And then some of our own got up and ran to the tomb and saw it and found it just as the women had said. Well, wait a minute. Luke, just 12 verses earlier in 24:12, you said it was just Peter that got up, and now you're saying some of our own, multiple people. What, are you contradicting yourself? You said just Peter. And Luke would say, no, I didn't say just Peter. I only mentioned Peter, but I didn't say only Peter went. Well, wait a minute, Luke. We don't do that in the 21st century today. So, they did it in the first century, it appears, doesn't it? We have a couple of instances here where we can show that they were doing it then. And again, we have to judge them according to how they were writing according to first century literary conventions, not 21st century. Listen, Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John did not sit on a committee for the misleading of future historians. Point number 2, the genre of the gospel. Genre means literary type. Now, there's all kinds of genre out there. For example, you turn on the evening news, it says, good evening, this is the evening news. Now, the genre that it's supposed to be, we're supposed to get a pithy, unbiased report of the world events of that day. Now, of course, we all know it doesn't matter what network we're watching. It might be pithy, but it is not unbiased. But that's what it's supposed to be. And we know what we're getting, and the intelligent person is going to be able to sift through some things and say, yep, oh, that's a spin. It may be true, but it is a spin, and it may be false. Well, what about when you pick up a book and it says, once upon a time? Well, that gives us a clue. It says what we're about to read is complete fiction, as soon as it says once upon a time. What about movies? Well, there are degrees of historical authenticity. For example, it could say based on a true story. What does that tell us? What we're about to view is almost identical to what happened. What if it says it's inspired by a true story? Well, that means the producers have taken a degree of dramatic license there, right? So that the actual people involved could watch that story and say, wow, that's a whole lot like what we were involved in. Well, what if it says, and then there's fiction. Now, I remember a few years back, my family, we got the DVD and we watched the movie Rules of Engagement. It's a great movie, very exciting. And afterward, I got thinking about, well, what are these guys doing today? Because at the very end of the movie, it said, in this, the colonel retired honorably and went on to do this. And the attorney got back into practice and gave up being an alcoholic and got control of that and went off and did this in this state. And I thought, wow, I wonder what they're doing today. So I looked it up online, and I found that they're not doing anything because they never existed. So it had this degree of verisimilitude here where it presented it as though it were true, but it wasn't. Another movie, I hate to disappoint you with this, but Facing the Giants. You know, I live in the Atlanta area, and the church that produced this movie is like 2.5 hours away from me in Georgia. And so watching that movie, I was just so inspired. And so I decided, I wonder what that football team is doing now. And so I went online and I looked, and I can't find the school anywhere, you know. And it's because it doesn't exist. It was like, wow. Well, so we have these different degrees of historical authenticity. Well, what about when we come to the Gospels? What are we looking at? Well, of course, the average Christian is going to say, well, we've got these accounts that presents everything exactly how it occurred. And of course, the problem is then when they bring up differences in the gospel, you say, exactly? Really? Well, what about this or this? Did Jesus carry his cross all the way, like John says? Or did Simon of Cyrene come in and help him, like Matthew, Mark, and Luke say? And did both thieves curse Jesus on the cross, like Mark says? Or did one say, Lord, remember me when you come into your kingdom, like Luke says? And you start to see these kinds of things. So we want to look at the Gospels as Greco-Roman biographies. And we find that this was a genre that looked to reporting history, but the authors, various biographers, varied in their degrees of how accurate they were. For example, Aristobulus was an ancient biographer of Alexander the Great, and Plutarch reports in his biography of Alexander that when Aristobulus presented his biography to Alexander the Great, it was during a voyage. Alexander started reading it, and then he took it and he threw it overboard. And he said, Aristobulus, I ought to throw you overboard after it, because you've made up so many stories about me that are so fantastic that people won't believe the great things that I've done. So we know that Aristobulus took great liberties and invented stories. But biography changed over the years, and that's the 4th century BC. By the time we get to the time of Jesus, there's like Suetonius, who's considered one of the 2 greatest Roman historians and biographers. He writes in the beginning of the 2nd century. And Plutarch. How do you like that name, Plutarch? You want to name your son something someday? Plutarch. So Plutarch, he's writing around the time of some of the Gospels are being written, and he's a Greco-Roman biographer. And he's very accurate, especially as we come closer to the time the people live closer to, that he's writing on, live closer to the time in which he lived. Now, there were certain literary liberties involved. So, for example, Ben Witherington, whom you heard last night, he says, we must realize that ancient historians were not nearly so concerned as we are today about minute details. Often they were satisfied with general rather than punctilious accuracy, so long as they presented the key points, thrust, and significance of a speech or event. How many of you are married? Okay, quite a few of you. All of you are going to know what I'm talking about then when I talk about there's the guy version of a story and there's the girl version of the story. The guy version of the story is very bullet point, just get to the bottom line. The girl version of the story is give me all the details. It's not that one is wrong and the other is okay, it's just, they're just different, right? So they're just different. So let's look at these and how the Gospels work. I want to look at different literary liberties. Chronology. We find Jesus talking about we find the Gospels reporting Jesus' temptation in the wilderness in both Matthew and Luke, turning stones into bread because you're hungry after 40 days of fasting. Or throw yourself down from the pinnacle of the temple and angels will rescue you. Or I'll give you all the kingdoms of the world if you'll just worship and serve me. Well, we see that the order of the second and third temptations are inverted in one of the Gospels. Which one is how it actually occurred? Who knows? But the thing is here that they're not saying this is exactly what happened in this order, didn't happen in the other order. A lot of times the Gospel authors aren't too concerned about the precise chronological details. Another is time compression. Now, let's talk about you got a couple of these happening, like with the example of Jairus' daughter. You'll have Mark, he gives us the girl version of the story. It's a lot, more detail involved. Matthew compresses it. So Mark will say that Jairus came up to Jesus and said, well, let's look at what he says, because I have it here. One of the synagogue officials named Jairus came up and on seeing Jesus fell at his feet and implored him earnestly, saying, "My little daughter is at the point of death. Come and lay your hands on her so that she will get well and live." And he went off with him. They came from the house of the synagogue official saying, "Your daughter has died. Why trouble the teacher anymore?" But Jesus, overhearing what was being spoken, said to the synagogue official, "Do not be afraid any longer, only believe." And he went He raised her. That's what Mark and Luke say. Now here's what Matthew says. A synagogue official came and bowed down before him and said, "My daughter has just died. But come and lay your hands on her and she will live." Jesus got up and began to follow him, and so did his disciples. Well, now Matthew and Luke say that what happened, she was still alive, and then the servants came up, but Matthew just gives the boy version of the guy version of the story and says, look, I'm just cutting right to it. For whatever reason, I don't want to give all these different details. Now, I know you ladies have problems with that. Because whenever, I know I'll be on the phone and I'll be talking to someone and recounting the story, and my wife will say in the background, "It didn't happen that way. You forgot this." And I'm saying, oh, come on. He doesn't want to hear about all that. I'm just getting to the bottom line. It's the guy version versus the girl version of the story. Matthew's just cutting right to it. What about the cursing of the fig tree? We find this again. Now, Mark gives us the girl version of the story again. That's his tendency. He's going to give us the details. How did things actually happen? Probably like Mark said over Matthew, because Matthew's doing the time compression. So it's the cursing of the fig tree. Here's what happens. Early in the morning, Jesus got up with his disciples, and they went into Jerusalem. And on the way, they saw a fig tree, and Jesus was hungry. So he went to see if there was fruit on it. There was no fruit on it, so he cursed it. And then they went into Jerusalem. The end of the day, they went back to Bethany. The next day, they got up early in the morning, and they were going back to Jerusalem, and they saw the tree, and it had withered and died. Now, Matthew tells the guy version of the story. Early in the morning, they left Bethany, went to Jerusalem, no fruit, cursed it, it died.